So how far are you willing to go to address climate change? In the world of insufficient emissions reductions and potential catastrophic risks from climate change, we may resort to approaches like stratospheric aerosol injection. This is where we put a bunch of aerosols in the atmosphere, most likely, let's say something like sulfur. This would whiten the sky ever so slightly, such that you reflect round about 1% of the incoming sunlight. And that cools the earth. And the idea here is that you're trying to buy time for renewables changes and innovation and development of negative emissions technologies. It's also important to point out that stratospheric aerosol injection is also relatively accessible. This is not like high-level machine intelligence where we have to come up with all these crazy innovations. Here, you'd mostly be working with modest adjustments to aircraft that already exists, essentially modified drones, in my opinion. One of the recent cost estimates for stratospheric aerosol injections puts it at round about 20 billion US dollars a year. And that might seem like a lot, but well, that's a lot cheaper than the trillions necessary for rapid and deep decarbonization. And 20 billion a year is also very much within the grasp of powerful states, coalitions, and private sector actors. So then it's really important to emphasize that in terms of actually making a difference to global temperatures in our lifetime in a good way, this is one of the most feasible things we can do. But it's also one of the most high-risk things we can do. Luke Kemp and I analyzed stratospheric aerosol injection along a holistic risk assessment that not only looks at direct threats, but also interactions with other hazards, systemic risks that can cascade across different global systems, and long-term latent risks. The point here is that we're not trying to just look at stratospheric aerosol injection in a vacuum. We're trying to look at stratospheric aerosol injection in the context of a crazy, unpredictable world that is also sometimes irrational. We're looking especially at some of the more extreme downside risks of stratospheric aerosol injection. The idea here is that, well, we're trying to look at the threats or issues that are most important to address, try to figure out if they even can be addressed, and get an overall, better picture of the risk profile of stratospheric aerosol injection, especially in comparison to climate change. So then the golden rule, if we're talking about potential risks of doing this stuff, is that it depends on how it's done. So then if you have, let's say, a thicker injection and you're masking more warming, or let's say you're doing things in a more uncoordinated way, let's say you have a bunch of different countries around the world kind of doing their own thing, then the impacts are most likely or more likely going to be severe. For instance, the big one in terms of direct threats of stratospheric aerosol injection is just the unknown ripple effects across ecological systems. So then we're playing around with energy balance here. When you inject aerosols in the atmosphere, that affects cloud formation. The big direct thing that could happen here is, you affect rainfall patterns that can affect broader drought patterns that can ripple into changes in plant or species distributions, which themselves can ripple further and further and further across ecological systems. The entire point here is that Earth systems are very, very complex. We won't really understand them. And as much as we want to do the research and get all our monitoring as perfect as possible, there's always going to be a specter of unknown unknowns across a complex ecological system. And it's also important to point out that if you want to have the best measurement you can have, you also need substantial improvements in climate and ecological monitoring across the world. And that also assumes that that climate impacts are going to be clear and measurable in the first place. But then that's only the biophysical. Things get a lot more ripply and crazy once you start thinking about the broader social and political knock-on effects. I mean, I can't go into too much detail now because it's a 7-minute talk, right? But then just to give you a taste, it's like you can potentially see a future where we do stratospheric aerosol injection, and for one reason or another, let's say agricultural yields in one country goes down. They might reasonably say, hey, you're playing around with sunlight, you're playing around with rainfall. I'm blaming you for this agricultural kind of tough spot that I'm in. We go into issues of attribution of impact. So then in climate science, impact attribution has always been an area of high uncertainty. This would be another area of high uncertainty. And even moving beyond the science, there's an issue of, misinformation. Could impact attribution or perception of impacts be driven by just poor media or poor public discourse? This could all lead into stratospheric aerosol injection becoming politicized, where it can foreseeably turn into, let's say, an election issue, where instead of having a very measured and delicate approach to how we manage a complex, delicate system, the management here would just be based off of, let's say, just election politics rather than a long-term strategy. But the big one is termination shock. So then if, let's say, we have this mask over the Earth and we remove it without reducing greenhouse gases underneath, we potentially risk slingshotting temperatures in a way which would essentially be worse than worst case climate change, where, let's say, if you're hiding 2 degrees and suddenly that mask comes off, suddenly we're in 2 degrees of warming, and that would happen in, let's say, a matter of decades. Climate change we see now since, let's say, 1850 is only around about 1.1 degrees. So then 2-3 degrees right now in a matter of decades, that's worse than worst case climate change. That's where we run into a problem of the Thanos dilemma, where just like snapping your fingers and killing half the universe to solve overpopulation, that might be a solution that's worse than the original problem, where, look, irresponsible interventions into Earth systems might be worse than the original problem of climate change. So what does this all mean in terms of a broader risk profile? Well, the way I see it is that it makes the more likely outcomes, actually, I'll get the little pointer. It makes the likely outcomes, let's say, more likely, so this curve would be more about here in terms of the peak, but it makes the unlikely outcomes, the fat tails, the unlikely catastrophes, the unknown ripples, those are substantially worse than climate change. And it's also worth pointing out, okay, what could knock off that mask over the Earth? Let's say extreme space weather, let's say nukes, let's say just poor economic decision-making. There are many things that could knock out this global mask. So then, in terms of what this means for future policy, look, first thing I'll say this: in a world that's ideal, where you have international cooperation to design and limit deployment, you would limit politicization, you improve climate monitoring, you change to renewables and negative emissions very, very quickly. In that ideal world, stratospheric aerosol injection can be very, very good. But we don't live in that world. We live in a world of complexity and chaos. So even initial attempts at governance and the UN Environment Assembly, for instance, have failed. And the governance issues will only get more difficult and political in the future moving on. It's also worth pointing out that we're on a pathway of around about 2 to 3 degrees, where we're looking at more scenario of a rapid escape clause rather than a clear measured response. So then my concluding point here is actually going to be very, very deeply unsatisfactory, but it's also very, very, very simple. And it's, look, stratospheric aerosol injection is probably very imprudent, but what else do we do? What else do we have? And I'll take questions from here.
Great. Question to end on. A great question from the audience, yeah.
Yeah, thanks for that. This is a new idea to me. I didn't know this, but my immediate response is we're starting on the route of going down to covering the Earth with volcanic ash or going for a nuclear winter, and there's a spectrum there that could start with aggressive intentions and end up doing the worst possible solution, isn't there?
Yeah, agreed. I mean, I think a big issue I see in the geoengineering literature right now is that there's an assumption that this stuff would be done just for climate. There's, just to alleviate climate issues. There's also another potential of, let's say, this stuff is just done to optimize climate, optimize rainfall, optimize something else. So then, agreed, yeah, there are potential uses potentially that we wouldn't even necessarily foresee.
Thank you. I just wanted to give you an opportunity to elaborate a little on your conclusion, because you left. I was surprised at the shift to, it's awful. It's going to be here are all these terrible, terrible effects, but maybe what else do we do? It might be nonetheless worth considering. So yeah, is your position that even notwithstanding all these terrible, terrible things, we should go ahead and engage in research and development, or do you think there should be, even at this early stage, we should just stop researching it and we shouldn't even contemplate it in any kind of form? So I guess just an invitation to say a bit more about what your conclusion at the end there.
Yeah, absolutely. I think my first gut reaction there is, is that I personally think that research should keep going. Deployment obviously seems very, very infeasible in terms of effective good governance. But I think a deeper and more important question there is how the research is done. So then, in terms of the framing of these approaches in current literature, especially among the more scientific modeling-based papers, it's very much about if you optimize these things and do these things, this would be good for global security. Well, it's not a would, it's could with a bunch of assumptions. If the research progresses and it frames this as a very reductionist technology, as the climate and Earth is something you can manage easily or relatively easily, then that's probably going to be more dangerous. If research continues, that's got a bit more humility, that better understands and integrates complexities in play, that can be more useful. But there's also the issue of, okay, what do you do about climate change? Also, a very simple and unsatisfactory answer. Like, it always just comes back to we just need to reduce emissions tomorrow. But that's not really going to happen, unfortunately, given how things are going right now.